Thank you, Eloise, and a warm welcome to all attendees joining us today. I'm really thrilled to be here as your moderator, representing Young Australians in International Affairs, which is a really proud partner of this forum and an organisation I founded almost 8 years ago. The themes of today's discussions are very much in line with our mission at Young Australians in International Affairs, which is to engage Australia's next generation of leaders in international discussions and to build the high calibre leaders Australia needs for the Indo-Pacific century. Today, I'm dialing in from Ngunnawal country, and I too would like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining the forum today. So as Eloise mentioned, I do also work for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. However, today I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm here in a personal capacity representing Young Australians in International Affairs. So just a very quick disclaimer that any comments or views expressed are very much my own and not those of the Australian government. So with that being said, our first panel for today, A Whole New World, asks, what are the new realities facing Asia-engaged young people at this time of significant global shift? Before we can work out how to thrive in a new interconnected world by learning from the people most actively engaged with Asia, i.e. our next generation, we need to take a step back to understand where we are currently at diplomatically, geopolitically, digitally, 18 months into a global pandemic. So today we're really fortunate to be able to hear from 3 key bilateral youth initiatives. So from Melbourne, we have Henry Liu, General Manager and Treasurer at the Australia-China Young Professionals Initiative, Annalise Giles, Board Director and Steering Committee Director of the Australia-Vietnam Leadership Dialogue. And tuning in a very early morning from New Delhi in India, we have Mithali Mukherjee, Steering Committee Member at the Australia-India Youth Dialogue. And finally, we're very privileged to also be joined from Canberra by Ridwan Jadwat, First Assistant Secretary of the Southeast Asia Division at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We're really fortunate to have Ridwan with us today because it's so important that these conversations don't just happen in a youth echo chamber, and also so that we understand how the government measures the value of youth in shaping our future engagement with the region. So you can read our speakers' full bios by clicking the Speakers tab on the platform page and clicking on their headshots. And at the end, there will be time for Q&A, so please remember to submit your questions for the panel via the Q&A tab. So with that being said, let's turn to the panel. So my first question is directed to Ridwan. Can you give us a broad outline of who Australia's priority partners are in the region, and with which countries in Asia do we have the strongest people-to-people links?
Well, thank you, Mercedes, and I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from where I'm sitting today, and that's the Ngunnawal people. And I'd like to acknowledge them as the traditional owners of this land and also pay my respects to their elders past and present. Look, it's really wonderful to be here today. I'm very honored to sit on this panel with so many young people who are here and who are engaged and passionate about Asia. I certainly think that Asia is the most important region for Australia, and our vision for a stable and prosperous Indo-Pacific remains at the forefront of Australia's foreign policy. And once our border settings allow, I think reinstating our people-to-people links and our in-person exchange programs will be a top priority. In terms of our partners in the region, obviously for me as head of the Southeast Asia division here in DFAT, I look at all of our Southeast Asian partners as crucial partners for us. And I think it is very important that we continue to build our links. And that includes, obviously, our people-to-people links, because I think building bridges between our different cultures and between our people is vital. And that is built also on long histories of cooperation. And many of these countries have fast-growing economies. Of course, they've been impacted by COVID, as we all have, but they remain vital economic partners for us and vital export markets for Australia. And ASEAN as a group, the 10 countries of ASEAN as a bloc, they are our second largest trading partner. And our economic recoveries from COVID are all closely intertwined. In terms of Southeast Asia and our priority partners, I mean, we have strong relationships with all of the countries of Southeast Asia, but we have comprehensive strategic partnerships with Indonesia, with Malaysia and Singapore. But every bilateral relationship in the region matters greatly to us, and we're building and elevating our ties with all of the countries of this part of the world. We also have, of course, beyond my patch in Southeast Asia, extremely strong relationships with the rest of Asia. And for example, in terms of education, we have very strong links, of course, with countries like China and India and Vietnam. And we also, of course, have long histories of migration from these countries. And our proximity to Southeast Asia means that those countries and their people remain an important part of the fabric of Australian society. And I think there's about almost 1 million Australians of Southeast Asian ancestry, and their diaspora groups here in Australia are playing a very important part in our society. I wanted to also just acknowledge that, in terms of how we have approached the region and in terms of the resilience of the region in coping through this pandemic, the government has made a major contribution to that, including last year when Prime Minister Morrison announced a package of about $500 million to support new economic development and security measures to support Southeast Asia's recovery from COVID-19. We've also pivoted our aid program to support health security, social stability, and economic recovery in the region. And of course, we're also playing our part in terms of support on vaccines. We recently announced vaccine support for Southeast Asia through almost $400 million in funding for various mechanisms. And also, we are doing our bit to make sure that we work closely with our development assistance partners in the region to make sure that we build their resilience and allow these countries to get through this pandemic with as much support as they can get from Australia. But overall, I think the picture for us is that we remain engaged, and it is vital that we play a strong role in helping to shape the future of this region. These countries their resilience is our resilience, and their recovery is our recovery. So I think we have to take into account how important all of Asia is to our future, that we are closely linked to this part of the world. The dynamism of the Indo-Pacific in particular is something that we need to be very conscious of. So I hope that through discussions like this today, that young people can build a greater sense of the importance of Asia. I think it's very important that we double down on Asia literacy and that we build a better understanding of Asia throughout our society. I think for a variety of reasons, we need to do that. So I hope that my participation today in this panel and also in future panels like this will also help to educate people about the role that government plays in helping to build bridges of understanding with Asia, and also to try and enhance our people-to-people links. And I think that the youth focus of today is a very important one, and I'm very much looking forward to working with all of you and talking to you about the future of Australia in Asia. So thank you very much, Mercedes, and I'm really pleased to be here today, and I look forward to this discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Ridwan. That was really interesting to get that high-level strategic perspective of Australia's relationships with Asia. So speaking of, you spoke about, the fast-growing economies in the region. So my next question is directed to Mithali. So Australia and India's relationship in the past couple of years seems to have been going just from strength to strength with high-level government visits as COVID has allowed and mutual economic strategies. So can you give us an overview of the relationship from a young leader's perspective, and how has your organisation in particular leaned into this, stronger relationship?
Thank you for that, Mercedes, and namaste from India. First up, congratulations to the Asia Society for successfully juggling these many time zones. I can imagine that in itself is a feat. I've mentioned this before, but I want to do that for the audience to point out that the Australia-India Youth Dialogue is the oldest running dialogue in terms of a bilateral relationship. And I want to take a few steps back before we talk about where the relationship is at right now. AIYD, as we call it, was actually born at a dark time in terms of where the relationship was. It was a direct outcome of the attacks on international students way back in 2009. And I think it was then that a group of young men and women who had deep roots both in Australia and India came together and really felt a strong urge to build something that was more tangible, to create more communication between the two communities, and to highlight the positive nature of this relationship. That's where AIYD was born. And, they say it's from times of adversity that real strength comes. So I think it's been a great arch for AIYD to have covered, to have started off at a point where relations were actually, perhaps at rock bottom, and then gradually grown from there. You're absolutely right, Mercedes. There's been a lot of traction and a lot of tailwind in terms of the Australia-India relationship since then. There's been, a lot of joshing around, both in terms of cricket, what happened with hockey at the Olympics, and of course, a lot of our cultural connections as well. Having said that, I think that the AIYD has worked very consciously at trying to build verticals of people-to-people engagement. And we are very mindful of the fact that we want to do this in every possible arena. So, we consciously try to pick young leaders who represent politics, of course, public diplomacy, but also the arts and media, science and technology, music. We've really got a motley bunch in terms of our alumni at this point. We have been mentioned in both the economic strategy reports, the one presented by Mr. Peter Verghese, and then the reciprocal report that was presented from India's side as well. AIYD found a mention in terms of the work that it's done on youth engagement and on building bilateral ties. Through the last couple of months, it has very honestly been difficult, especially for organizations such as ours that really thrive on people-to-people engagement, on physical connections, on bringing everyone into a room and making them connect. But we've worked hard both in terms of bringing the youth perspective, Mercedes, in terms of what they see as imperatives right now in a post-COVID arena. And that, of course, includes facets like education, science and tech, health right on top over there. And we're trying to do more to get some of these youth-led ideas to really shine a light on them, to give them a platform that AIYD can, to give them access that AIYD can, and of course to try and build the kind of financial and other support that these young leaders might need in terms of driving through on their ideas on bilateral engagement. So I'll wind it down there. I'm sure there'll be lots more to talk about, but I think that's really a snapshot of the 10-year journey that AIYD has covered.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mithali. I think, it's just really fascinating and really great to just see how dynamic the next generation is in the Australia-India relationship, and all the credit to AIYD for facilitating that over such a long time. So my next question is directed to Henry. So Australia's relationship, in contrast, is becoming more and more strained. What is the reality of working or operating within national interests as someone who is passionate about the China-Australia relationship? And how is this broader dynamic affecting AUCYPI members?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here today. It's really great to be joining in this discussion. I think in response to the question, the first thing I would point out is I think there's a common misconception for people who may be unfamiliar with China to assume because of its political system that a lot of its citizens are blindly patriotic. It's definitely not the case from my own personal experience, especially with the young professional cohort who have had increasingly access to international media and influences, whether it be their friends and colleagues who've studied abroad and come home, or even access to media and social platforms via the internet. All of this has really shaped their independent thought and their ability to assess situations on their individual merits. So at ACYPI, we haven't seen this notion of a conflict between preserving national interests compared to a person's passion for the Australia-China relationship. But what we have seen is that the political tensions do create obstacles and limit the channels for young professionals to continue their engagement. So, for example, when China introduced certain tariffs on commodities, what that meant was that young professionals operating within those sectors had limited avenues to communicate with their counterparts because, the businesses that they represent no longer found it economic to continue that trading relationship. And even from my own perspective, I think it's important to acknowledge that even though there are obstacles that exist at a political level, it doesn't change or taint the view that I have of my friends, of my colleagues, of my business partners in China. What it does mean is that we need to find different avenues in which we can communicate and different operating models to be compliant within the current regulatory environment. And indeed, these concepts are very well supported in research. In a public opinion poll that was conducted by Global Times in June during the peak of the political tensions, it still found that 55% of the Chinese respondents still viewed the Australia-China relationship very positively. And in commerce, just this month, in a joint survey that was released by KPMG and the University of Sydney, it found that over 60% of the business executives still saw Australia as a safe environment for Chinese investments compared to other countries. And so I think in summary, it becomes really incumbent on organisations such as ACYPI and indeed, organisations that all of the panellists represent to really advocate for people-to-people relationships and build a sense of community, because it's through these platforms that individuals are able to find a channel to continue their engagement, and we aren't necessarily impacted as heavily from the political level or the macro level issues that countries experience from time to time.
Thank you, Henry. Look, best of luck in your mission, which is, it's never been so important that we do have strong people-to-people links. So, good luck with all of your work. My next question is for Elise. So, Elise, Vietnam, from an outsider's perspective, seems to be somewhat of a new kid on the block in terms of major players in our region. Would you say Vietnam is fast becoming a new favourite partner for Australia, and why is that?
Thanks so much, Mercedes. And I think personally, my opinion is that Australia has always had Vietnam as one of its favourite partners. And while the Australia-Vietnam Leadership Dialogue has been around for over 6 years now, we are a little bit newer. But I think for everybody doing the census on Tuesday night, what you would have seen listed within the 6 countries of the census for your country of origin, being Vietnam was one of them. And I think that really speaks to Australia's migration story, but also, I guess, the richness in our diversity that makes up our nation, and that real influence from Vietnam. So I think we see that from a people-to-people lens, but I guess if you're asking me from an economic point of view, yes, Vietnam seems to be the flavour potentially of the year. But I think that's really seen in terms of Australia's trade and investment profile. We have had our economic eggs in one particular basket for a long time, and we're really seeing companies wanting to diversify their markets and considering Vietnam. But I think that we know that while that is potentially a newer space for Australian business, that actually this has been happening pre-COVID and from about 2019, where we saw a lot of other countries exploring Vietnam, and some big names there like Nike and Adidas and things like that. So really, from an Australian perspective, Prime Minister Morrison made that commitment with the Vietnamese Prime Minister back in 2019 around a concerted effort to really boost the trade and investment relationship. The 2 ambitious goals there was top 10 trading partners, and the second is doubling two-way investment. So that is ambitious. It requires, the words that are coming out from both countries are surging, bolstering our practical ways of trade and investment. But I must say, and really important within our people-to-people work that we do, is that this relationship can't just be built purely on economic terms. Particularly, we know, with Vietnam and our Asian counterparts, that relationships are critical to that. And I think that that's where we really see the value of these dialogues. So that's my perspective. I don't think we're that new. Thanks, Mercedes.
Thanks, Elise. And actually, just as a bit of a follow-up, so as a bilateral dialogue with very strong presence in both countries, can you paint us a bit of a picture of how that actually works in practice as you go about delivering your work?
Yeah, sure. And I think it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the challenging situations happening in Vietnam at the moment, and as many other countries around the world as well. They are in restrictions. Our family, friends and colleagues in Vietnam, so they're presenting, I guess, a lot of difficulty in terms of online engagement at the moment. For those who know Vietnam well, they generally have a fighting spirit. And I think that we see that from more of an external point of view is the government's commitment around digital transformation. And that's where we're seeing a lot of opportunity, but also in the way that we engage from an Australian perspective with Vietnam. And I think that we have a lot to share in terms of technology and Australia supporting the development there, because we see, on the Vietnam side, a real change in the way in which they're communicating from a made in Vietnam to a make in Vietnam, and that really is demonstration of the growth of Vietnam from what people perceive as manufacturing and textiles to really where we're seeing through our delegates pioneers and these young people who are trailblazers in developing new technologies and alternative proteins and doctors of the year. So that's, I think, a brief summary of the way in which we're operating right now. But we're also observing these phenomenal leaders coming out of Vietnam, driving and innovating, really actually pushing us here in Australia and collaborating together.
Thank you so much, Elise. That's so interesting. So I'm very conscious that we've only got just over 10 more minutes for our moderated discussion before we move to Q&A. So I'm going to just ask our next panelists to kind of whiz through our next couple of questions. So Ridwan, bringing it back to a strategic level, given the new realities that young people are navigating, how does the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade engage youth at the foreign policy making level, and what more can be done?
Thank you, Mercedes. Well, I guess I'm the oldest person on the panel today, but I used to be a young person once, and I do recall how outward-looking young people are, and I think it's very important in government that we harness the enthusiasm and the diversity of young people and the perspectives that they bring to everything that we do. So I think it's critical in our foreign policy priorities and our settings that we tap into future leaders, especially through youth exchange programs, which has been something that we've worked on for many years now. And I think that the connections that we build through these programs will continue to pay dividends into the future. I'm very proud of the youth exchange programs that DFAT has run, and that includes the Australia-Indonesia Youth Exchange Program, the Australia-ASEAN Muslim Exchange Program, the Australia-ASEAN Emerging Leaders Program. All of these programs, I think, have built those bridges of understanding between young business leaders and academics and diplomats and influential decision makers in these countries. Young people obviously are quite attuned to trends and emerging issues in countries. They understand digitization and social media better than I think anybody else. So I think they can be powerful forces in driving economic and social change in our societies. And I think that young people have a very important role to play in telling our national story So I think that the reach of young people is beyond what some of our diplomats can do, and we need to harness those skills, as I said at the beginning. So I think young people matter, and we need to make sure that we work very closely with the youth of our country and with the youth of our region in building better partnerships throughout Asia and beyond.
Thank you, Ridwan, and I certainly agree. I think today's panel is just testament to the power that young people can have in driving foreign policy decisions, but also on better people-to-people links. So my next question is to Mithali. So as a business journalist reporting on global politics and economics, in what ways are you seeing young people and young professionals in AIYD or beyond leading the charge in terms of maintaining global connection to peers in Australia or other countries in the new world that we are facing?
Thank you for that, Mercedes. Let me split this answer up in two parts. One, in terms of what the larger picture is, and secondly, what's happening in terms of what youth leaders can do. So there's obviously a lot of traction, as we discussed before. I think politically, it's important and noteworthy that the idea of a quad is something that is so actively discussed at this point. I think if you were to raise that term or discuss that about maybe even 2 years back, you wouldn't get too much of a response in terms of either people understanding what the Quad meant or the importance of it. So politically, I think there's a lot that's happened in terms of ground covered. Economically, it's a little more tricky because there's a lot of goodwill and a lot of intent on both sides, but I don't think it's fructified into something very concrete yet. There was a palpable sense of disappointment when India chose to walk away from RCEP. It was seen as a crucial trade agreement and arrangement between a lot of like-minded nations, but that unfortunately did not work out. However, I do believe there's still a lot of conversation that's happening in terms of how trade ties can be bettered and built upon between the two nations, of course, but on a larger basis as well. It's interesting that the conversation so far, I think, at a macro level, has really centered around old economy conversations. You know, what to do with traditional brick and mortar businesses, what to do on the natural resources side. And now we're sensing a pivot, particularly led by youth thought and engagement into newer spaces. So something interesting that AIYD did through last year, which was really quite hellish for everyone, is that we spent a lot of time doing a deep dive consultation with our alumni. So we held a lot of sessions with them, and through the feedback that we got, we created something called the Build Back Better report. This was presented to both the governments. The report itself was formally launched by the Honorable Minister Marie Spain. So we were very glad to really have the buy-in of sorts, or at least the blessings of both Indian and Australian governments. And that's where we identified a couple of crucial areas of engagement. Education, as you know, Maurice, is really big for both the nations. That has hit a bit of a curveball because of COVID, and there is some stress on the Indian side for students and when they can actually be in universities and be studying. That was highlighted. Health is an important area of partnership. India had 2 very, very intense COVID waves, and I think it really brought to light the importance of both health tech and innovation and partnership that could happen between nations around health and public healthcare systems. There was, of course, education and arts. There was tech and innovation. So there's, newer pockets, I think, that are opening up in terms of economic engagement. And one quick aside that we found interesting at AIYD is that very often when we come out of the dialogue, it also produces the idea or the seeds of partnership or an actual partnership between, members from both sides, from the Aussie side and the Indian side, where they go on to explore what kind of collaboration they can look at and whether one of them can move to the other nation and look at business, business ideas in their respective nations. Also, quick shout out to the Vietnam gang. You guys have definitely been around and are a part of the process, and we've been very happy to host you at many of our gatherings in Sydney and Melbourne. So certainly not a bilateral only. It's, we're spreading the cheer in the neighborhood.
That's excellent. Thank you. So My next question is to Henry. So we've already touched on some of the current challenges or not of operating in the Australia-China space. So I just wanted to quickly see if you could reflect on how ACYPI, fills some of the gaps when there are difficulties in the broader relationship.
I think there's an important distinction, I think, which is implicit in your question, that there is a difference between, I guess, macro level issues and concerns in the bilateral relationship versus individuals who are active in the Australia-China space at a grassroots level. So at ACYPI, we place a very strong emphasis and we strongly advocate for the development of people-to-people relationships, and really to build a sense of community where people can get to know each other, find out, how that relationship can be mutually beneficial. So over the last 12 months, since the political tensions have increased, but also, as a consequence of the pandemic, we've really placed stronger focus on two key areas. The first is curating panelists and having seminars that showcase Australia-China excellence. What we want to achieve out of this is to really draw that distinction between macro level issues and really to showcase to our members and draw that stability that there are still a lot of people out there who are achieving excellence and achieving success in their respective areas, relying on that bilateral relationship between Australia and China. The second area that we focused on is on networking, and it's probably one of the areas that I'm most proud of. And I know this probably sounds a little ironic for an organisation like ours, but we had always been set up to operate on a state basis. So our focus has always been within each committee level to curate events and programs that are targeted to our members in a particular state. But what we've, revised and had to think about is, well, how can we channel and bridge communication between the two countries? And how can we bridge communication in the sense that, if there are any ambiguity or uncertainties that are drawn as a consequence of the political instability, how can we bridge that? And so, I know everybody's probably very sick of Zoom, but we've really used that platform quite heavily to have events where we bring the two countries together and have our members have open dialogue, open discussion, have networking and build their communities. And we've really used avenues such as, for example, having trivia nights, having wine tasting, having cocktail making workshops. And I think we shouldn't overlook or trivialize these type of networking events, because I think it actually is quite important in building that sense of community and returning stability to that relationship.
Thank you, Henry. So just a bit of a public service announcement. We'll continue our discussion until 12 o'clock. So we've got a couple of extra minutes for question and answers. But I did just want to note that unfortunately Ridwan will have to leave us. So I did want to direct my next question to him so that he can log off as he needs to. So Ridwan, as a career diplomat with strong personal ties to the region, how important are personal connections with peers in Asia at this time? And how did your personal experience navigating new cultures at a young age influence your career journey to date?
Well, thank you, Mercedes. Look, I think those personal connections remain integral, I think, to how I do my work. I was born in South Africa and lived under apartheid. My family immigrated to Australia in 1981 when I was 9 years old. And so we lived under segregation in apartheid, and we sought freedom and opportunity in Australia. And my ancestors from my mum and father's side are very mixed, including Javanese ancestry on my mother's side. They were brought originally as slaves and political prisoners by the Dutch in the 17th century, and my father's family descended from Indian merchants who came to South Africa in the 19th century. So when I've been on posting and when I do my job in Asia and in the Middle East, I've drawn on those, the history of my family, our ancestry, and my connections. And I think it's not only myself, but I think millions of us in Australia. Of course, we are a country where 50% of Australians were either born overseas or have at least one parent born overseas. So I think we have a good story to tell about our decades of migration. And I think that can help inform how we build connections with the region and with Asia in particular. So I think it's very important that we use those personal experiences in navigating new cultures. And for me, it certainly influenced the way I do business and the way that I try to build links and connections with my key interlocutors in the region. And I think when you go into the region, including in my other role I have as special envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and when I have visited countries like Indonesia and Malaysia and Brunei, for example, and I spoke to young audiences, a lot of them were quite surprised to know that I was an Australian ambassador and that the history of my family and that I'm a Muslim Australian, for example. These are sorts of things that young people did not quite grasp, I think, about Australia. So I think we need to educate young people more about the strength of our multiculturalism and the strength of our cultural and racial diversity. I think that enriches us as a nation and as a country and as a society. And I think we need to draw on that in our diplomacy. And I think that, we have a multicultural gold mine that we're sitting on in Australia. And I think that helps to build a better national story for us. So I think all of us, it's incumbent on all of us, not just diplomats, to benefit and draw on that strength of our diversity in the work that we do. So I think it's very important. And I think it certainly has played a crucial role in how I use my own story to tell a bigger story about Australia when I'm overseas, including in my most recent role as ambassador to Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Ridwan. What a powerful personal story, and a really, I think, a strong rallying cry for multiculturalism in Australia. So thank you so much, and thank you very much for joining today's panel. We really appreciate your insights.
Thank you.
So I think we have time for one very, very quick wrap-up question, which I'll direct to Mithali first, Henry second, and Elise to end. So why is the work of Asia-focused dialogues and organisations so important, and what further support would you like to see for your organisations moving forward? And if you could do that in about 60 seconds each, that would be fantastic.
Okay, TikTok, here I go. I think there's a great sense of community amongst the Asian region, and it's important, as I was saying earlier, not just to look at this through the lens of the bilateral between Australia and India, or Australia and Vietnam, or Australia and China, but to think about how this entire community can come together and build a stronger bridge in terms of relations with Australia. What can be done going ahead? Support, engage. Young leaders have fantastic ideas. They're so full of idealism. I think that needs to be encouraged and nurtured. Many of those ideas need to see the light of day via financial support. AIYD has organized and created 2 grants for some of our dialogue members in terms of very novel ideas that they wanted to put in action as rehabilitation ideas post-COVID. That's one. And the other, for all the 600 plus audience that's joined in, I think dialogues like ours thrive because we have fantastic, bright young people like you coming in. So read about us, come in, engage with us. I do have more and more learning more about this relationship. So, you don't think about what are the roots I have with this. Just come in and become a part of it. You will become the roots one of these days. I think I've stopped at 60. I'm going to pass the baton on to the next speaker.
I think I want to really echo those sentiments. We at our organisation really do emphasise that it's the people to people and that community element which is the most critical mandate that we have within our organisation. And a lot of the times when there are political tensions or if their issues arise, I think people often forget that human element. At the end of the day, yes, it is between 2 countries, but ultimately those countries are made up of individuals and citizens. And so, at ACYPI, an organisation similar to us, we really do provide that channel and that bridge. In terms of future support, I think I echo the sentiments that we really do need sort of senior support in showcasing and putting a spotlight on the bilateral relationship, and showcase that there are a lot of individuals and young professionals with great ideas and projects that we should definitely foster to really make this relationship flourish into the future.
And then I'm going to jump in and from Eloise's first quiz and poll, what was one of the biggest challenges facing our region? And I think that's climate change. And really, I see the role of these youth dialogues in really elevators of young people from both countries or various countries in finding those solutions fundamental to this global crisis. So I think that that's where we will see the value come out of these dialogues. And I think in terms of where we need future support, I think that we know, financial sustainability is difficult, but if we're looking to corporate Australia to really invest in, Asia literacy, investing in young people through these dialogues would be something that I would certainly encourage, in addition to government and in addition to not-for-profits. So that's my perspective. Thanks.
Thank you very much to each of you for answering those questions. So we'll now move over to audience Q&A, and we've got a couple of questions lined up for us. I'm very conscious that we've only got 10 minutes to wrap things up. So again, I'll unfortunately have to ask everyone to be quite concise in their answers. But we do have one question around whether we will see the return of student mobility, especially from Australia to Asia after borders reopen and vaccination rates are sufficiently high, which I think it would be really great if, again, each of you could very briefly answer. Sorry, and starting with Elise.
I certainly think that what makes the fabric and the diversity of our engagement between both countries is student exchange. That's certainly where my personal journey was created, from an exchange in Vietnam. I do expect that it will return over time, but I see now, the success of online engagement, being able to do virtual study tours and connecting deeper and wider with Vietnam and with Australia than we've ever done before. So I do think it'll look very different, but I do think that nothing can really replace a physical face-to-face connection and sitting in a local street in Hanoi eating bún chả together and building those relationships. So here's hoping. Thanks, Mercedes.
Here's hoping indeed. Henry, how about you?
I definitely think that there will be a return to international students coming into Australia to complete their higher education. So prior to the pandemic, Chinese individuals and students coming to study abroad represented 40% of all international students. And so I don't see that dynamic changing even in the short term. I think once the vaccination goes up and overseas travel is lifted, that will return. Chinese sentiments towards the Australian education sector is still very high, and we're held very highly regarded within the country.
Thank you. Mithali, was there anything further that you would like to add?
Yeah, just very quickly, as a journalist, I can tell you the two terms that I've heard used most often is never before and life-changing. So I think, it's been so uncertain, the path that we've covered in the last 18 months. There really is no telling where things might go. Having said that, look, there is certainly anxiety amongst these young students who do want to go and get a physical experience in terms of studying in universities in Australia or vice versa, as the case may be. I think what we need to be mindful of at this point is that safety is really paramount. So I know that nations are making their own decisions and they're moving at different curves, both in terms of vaccination and opening up. Patience is key, but I think young students especially should be mindful of the fact that safety comes even before that. So perhaps your semester gets a little bit delayed and you do have to live with this weird Zoom life. but hang in there. I think on both sides, Australia and India, that I'm speaking of, intent is very high, and they do want to see all these young folks get that educational experience that they've been waiting for.
Fantastic. Well, yes, he is hoping. So unfortunately, I think we've just got time for one final question, which again, I think would be really fantastic if each of you could answer. And the question is, how has the pandemic affected the extent of the impact young people can have in shaping Australia's Asia engagement? And do you find policymakers listen more or less to young people's needs now? And perhaps we could start with Henry for this question.
I definitely think it's had a positive influence. I think it's really shone a light on young professionals and the impact and their engagement. So I view it as an opportunity, really, and there's always a silver lining to everything in life, in that now is really a critical moment for young professionals to speak up and be heard. And there's a lot of avenues, not just at ACYPI, but at a government level, that those young professionals can come up and speak their mind and have their thoughts and opinions tabled to really shape that relationship in the future once we sort of get back to, a COVID normal state, and when international travel resumes and all of, the good things that come up with, having a really high sort of vaccination rates and us returning back to normal.
Thank you, Henry. Mithali?
Yeah, I agree with Henry. I think, think about if this pandemic had struck 15 years back. We are so blessed to have the technology we do around us, and I think young people have embraced it and worked with it better than anyone else can. So it really has shone a light on the skills and abilities of young leaders and young professionals. I think access has not been a problem, but it has been bereft of that physical connect. So we have had greater engagement, and we have been able to put the younger point of view across to governments and to senior public authorities. Intent has been high. I think that's the most important. We just have to navigate our way through this very tricky phase till we get back to something of what 2019 looked like. But certainly, I think this has been a good opportunity for young leaders.
Thank you. And Elise, was there anything that you would like to add?
I certainly agree with both of the panelists' views there. I think the other perspective for us, and I'm sure for the other dialogues really, is that we've been able to hear a change in the voices, and that's hearing a much more diverse voice across the relationships. We're being able to access, people in rural and regional parts of Vietnam, but also in Australia as well. And so that, I think, changes the way in which we advocate. It changes the way in which governments hear what's of most importance to both of our countries. So really, while it may look different, from an online perspective, actually the voices that we're hearing now is, if not better quality than we have had in the past.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, thank you to all of you, Elise, Mithali, Henry and Ridwan, for a really insightful discussion this morning. I know that I've been taking down notes as everyone has been talking, and I know that we could probably talk for hours and still have more stuff to discuss. But to our audience, thank you so much for your participation so far. We're going to take a short 10-minute break, but please make sure you stay on the platform to chat and network, because there are more exciting speakers to come. So our next session begins at 12:20, discussing youth politics in Asia, interviewing 2 MPs from major sides of Australian politics on the value of engaging youth at the senior policy and decision-making level as we reconfigure our regional engagement. So make sure you stay tuned in for that, and see you all soon. Thank you very much.